Oskar Schindler was no saint. He was a hustler, a smooth-talking con artist who perpetually chased his next fortune. Only one thing drove him: money. He even joined the Nazi Party in a desperate bid to get rich, yet this very same man went on to become one of the Holocaust's greatest heroes. The charming deception that had once served his greed became his sharpest weapon against the Nazis. He bribed SS officers, drained his own fortune smuggling food and medicine, and repeatedly gambled with his life to rescue over 1,200 Jews from the gas chambers. His own wife despised him, yet the Jews he saved revered him as their savior, standing by him long after the war had left him broke. Schindler had always been a troublemaker. As a teenager, he earned the nickname Schindler the Crook for petty offenses like forging his report card and stealing from customers. He wed Emily Pelzel at 19, squandered her dowry on a flashy automobile, and kept multiple mistresses. Public drunkenness had landed him behind bars on more than one occasion. Yet beneath all the bravado, Schindler harbored one true obsession: cold, hard cash, and his greatest flaw was his inability to hold on to it. He bankrupted his family's business, flopped as a salesman, and drifted from one dead-end job to the next. Born into a prosperous family in the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, Schindler grew up fiercely loyal to his German heritage. When the pro-Nazi Sudetenland German Party began gaining traction, he recognized a golden opportunity, not out of ideology, but for the profitable connections it offered. In 1936, those connections helped him secure a role with Nazi Germany's military intelligence, selling secrets about Czech railways and troop movements. It was a solid hustle, and if it helped the Nazis annex the Sudetenland, that was merely a side effect. He considered himself German, after all. The scheme lasted until Czech authorities arrested him for espionage, and that might have been the end of his story had history not intervened. Just months after his arrest, the Nazis annexed the Sudetenland, and Schindler walked free. He immediately applied for Nazi Party membership and, despite his criminal record, was accepted. When World War II erupted, he arrived in Nazi-occupied Krakow, joining the wave of German businessmen eager to convert chaos into profit. By day he dealt in illegal black market goods. By night he downed drinks with SS officers, charming his way through Nazi social circles and earning a reputation as a slick opportunist who always had a beautiful woman on his arm. As the Nazis stripped Poles of their properties and businesses, Schindler spotted his moment. Leveraging his connections, he convinced them to hand him control of an enamelware factory outside the city, one seized from its Jewish owners. Since he had no idea how to actually run a factory, he leaned on Abraham Bankier, the Jewish manager who had operated the plant before it was commandeered. With Bankier overseeing daily operations, Schindler kept the business afloat, and by 1941 it was thriving. He was finally accumulating the wealth he had always craved. But outside those factory walls, Krakow was rapidly deteriorating. The Nazis had launched their campaign to eradicate Jewish life across Europe. Humiliation became routine. SS officers dragged elderly men into the streets, shaved their beards, and forced them to scrub pavements. Then came something worse. The city's 15,000 Jews were herded into a ghetto, an open-air prison of barbed wire and stone. With the ghetto came a new Nazi policy allowing factory owners to rent Jewish forced laborers for a fraction of the cost of Polish workers. To Schindler, it was too profitable to resist, and Jewish workers soon streamed into his factory. While other factory owners beat and overworked their Jewish laborers, Schindler ensured his workers were adequately fed and went out of his way to secure medicine for the ill. He still put profit first, but the more time he spent among his workers, the more something inside him began to stir. In July 1942, that shift became irreversible. Nazis stormed the Krakow ghetto, beating anyone in their path and forcing Jews onto trains bound for the Belzec extermination camp. 14 of Schindler's workers, including his trusted manager Bankier, were shoved into cattle cars headed toward certain death. Schindler couldn't simply stand by. Somehow, he persuaded the Nazis that he needed those men to keep his factory running, and it worked. They were pulled from the train. For a brief moment, he exhaled, 14 lives spared. But the relief faded quickly. Thousands more were being packed into cattle cars and driven to their doom. He later reflected, beyond this day, no thinking person could fail to see what would happen. I was now resolved to do everything in my power to defeat the system. His transformation was complete. The money-hungry opportunist who had once exploited Nazi connections was now willing to sacrifice everything: his wealth, his reputation, his very life. Some 370 Jews labored in his factory. He couldn't save everyone, but he was determined to save every single person he could, even if it meant going head-to-head with the Nazi regime itself. Schindler's opportunity to stand against the Nazis came sooner than he had anticipated. In March 1943, the Nazis announced the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto. Its residents would either be deported to the Plazow forced labor camp or shot on sight. Determined to shield his workers, Schindler kept them inside the factory overnight as the Nazis tore through the ghetto. They survived the initial purge, but were soon deported to Plazow regardless. If the Krakow ghetto had been a nightmare, Plazow was something far worse. Prisoners rarely lasted more than a few weeks under the reign of a Mongoth, known as the Butcher of Plazow, who would shoot inmates from his villa balcony purely for amusement, randomly line them up for abuse, and then calmly return to his classical music as though nothing had occurred. Schindler understood he had to be cunning. He slipped back into his familiar role as the charming opportunist, befriending Goth, spending long nights drinking with him, and plying him with black-market caviar and cigarettes. When the moment came, he didn't beg for his workers' lives. Instead, he complained that the 10-kilometer daily commute between the camp and factory was draining his laborers' productivity. His solution: let the workers live on the factory grounds. It took a substantial bribe, but Goth eventually agreed to establish a smaller subcamp near the Emalia factory for all the Jews working in the vicinity. The Emalia subcamp was no paradise, but compared to Plazow, it felt like a sanctuary. There were no arbitrary beatings, no prisoners collapsing from exhaustion, no guard dogs lunging at inmates. When food and medicine ran short, Schindler spent his own money purchasing supplies off the black market. Schindler deployed every old trick in his arsenal, but this time, not for personal gain. As the war dragged on, he needed a legitimate reason to keep the factory operational, so Emalia began producing mess kits and ammunition shells, positioning itself as vital to the war effort. What the Nazis never discovered was that Schindler's workers were deliberately manufacturing defective bullets, and that his labor rosters were forged, falsifying skills and ages to make even the elderly and gravely ill appear indispensable. His resistance extended well beyond the factory. Working covertly with Jewish relief networks, he smuggled money, correspondence, and critical information to prisoners with the help of sympathetic locals. He even traveled to Budapest to personally alert the Hungarian Relief and Rescue Committee about the atrocities unfolding in Poland. The danger was immense. Had the Gestapo uncovered any of this, he would have been executed on the spot. The Gestapo paid several unannounced visits to interrogate him, but each time Schindler deftly deflected them with vodka and black market gifts. By the summer of 1944, his factory had quietly become a refuge for over 1,450 Jewish prisoners. He was earning a considerable fortune, and spending nearly every cent on bribes, food, and medicine for his workers. Then the Red Army began closing in on Krakow. Panicking, the Nazis evacuated Plazow and its subcamps, shipping prisoners westward, and ordered all armaments factories to relocate deeper into Germany. Schindler watched helplessly as SS officers forced hundreds of his workers into cattle cars bound for the Mauthausen concentration camp. With his black market funds, he bribed the officers to provide the prisoners with water along the route, hoping that small act of mercy might improve their odds of survival. When he learned that the remaining prisoners of Plazow were to be deported to Gross-Rosen and Auschwitz, Schindler moved swiftly. He bribed Goth with jewels, vodka, and women to secure authorization to transfer a group of Jewish prisoners to a new factory site. In the autumn of 1944, the factory was relocated to Brunlitz in his homeland of the Sudetenland, and he was permitted to bring 1,000 Jewish prisoners with him. The critical question then became, who would be on that list? Before the transfer could be finalized, Schindler was arrested on charges related to bribing Goth. In his absence, a group of Jewish prisoners frantically assembled the documents that would come to be known as Schindler's List, two rosters compiled after agonizing hours of deliberation, 700 men and 300 women. Some were Schindler's former workers, most had never worked for him. Some families had paid their way onto it, others were simply fortunate. If your name appeared on that list, you had a fighting chance at survival. After more than a week in custody, Schindler was released, and the chosen 1,000 were loaded onto trains bound for the new factory. But the transports were diverted en route. The men ended up at Grossrosen, and the women arrived at the gates of Auschwitz. The men were freed within days, but the women remained stranded in Auschwitz, their survival growing less certain with each passing day. Schindler eventually negotiated a deal with camp authorities. The women would be released in exchange for 7 Reichsmarks per worker, per day. He agreed without hesitation. It was an extraordinary and unprecedented arrangement, the only moment in Auschwitz's horrific history when Jews were permitted to leave alive while the gas chambers were still in operation. When the women finally arrived at Brunlitz, gaunt and starving, a row of male prisoners met them with tears and outstretched hands. SS officers stood grimly nearby as Schindler calmly reassured the women, "There's hot soup waiting for you. Don't worry, you are with me now." The Brunlitz factory operated from October 1944 until the war's end. The Schindlers lived at the camp itself, their very presence acting as a buffer against Nazi brutality. As the war wore on and food grew increasingly scarce, Schindler continued scouring the black market for whatever he could obtain for his workers. On Jewish holidays, he somehow managed to secure a little extra so his prisoners could observe the occasion with some dignity. Emily Schindler, too, risked her life, repeatedly slipping in and out of the factory to smuggle food and medicine, often surrendering her own meals to feed the prisoners. As nearby factories were abandoned and the Soviet advance intensified, Schindler permitted his workers to take wool from neighboring sites, which was fashioned into sweaters and mittens to ward off the brutal winter. He even managed to smuggle firearms into the camp so his workers could defend themselves should the Nazis attempt to eliminate them before the Soviets arrived. The camp's population continued to grow. In January 1945, the Schindlers intervened to rescue over 100 Jewish men from Goleschau, a subcamp of Auschwitz, who had been locked inside 2 cattle cars for 7 days with no food, water, or shelter from the freezing cold. The SS commandant on site was prepared to send them back until Emily stalled long enough for Schindler to arrive and persuade him that he needed the men as factory laborers. When the cattle car doors were finally opened, 107 frostbitten, skeletal figures stared back at them. The Schindlers swiftly arranged medical care and food. 13 men had perished during the journey, and Schindler even convinced the commandant to allow their burial in accordance with Jewish law, overriding the Nazi intention to simply burn the bodies. Life at Brunlitz was a perpetual gamble. Schindler lacked his usual leverage over the camp commandant, making his familiar methods far more difficult to employ. Meanwhile, the factory continued operating, but it was producing almost nothing of military value. Over its entire existence, the plant turned out a single wagon load of usable ammunition. Whenever an SS guard appeared, everyone rushed to look occupied. The moment he left, they returned to knitting sweaters. For the 1,098 prisoners at Brunlitz, survival itself had become the only true mission. The ordeal finally came to a close in May 1945. Germany surrendered, and whatever remained of Europe's Jewish population could at last begin to rebuild. But Schindler was not yet out of danger. As a former German intelligence operative, he risked being apprehended as a war criminal if the Soviets found him. He and Emily had no choice but to flee. Before departing, Schindler gathered his workers for one final address, urging them to hold on to hope, remain humane, and preserve order. He cautioned them against seeking revenge on the Germans, and reminded them of the ordinary civilians around the factory who had risked their own safety to smuggle in food. He also expressed his gratitude to the Jewish workers who had labored alongside him to rescue so many lives. "Do not thank me for your survival," he told them. "Thank your own people who worked day and night to save you." The prisoners were unwilling to let their savior leave empty-handed. With what little food remained, they baked him a birthday cake. One prisoner contributed a gold tooth, which was melted down and shaped into a ring, inscribed with the Talmudic phrase, "He who saves one life saves the entire world." And that was precisely what Schindler had done, saved over 1,000 worlds. He often referred to his factory as his Noah's Ark, preserving a cross-section of Jewish society amid the devastation of Nazi rule. The Schindlers eventually reached Allied-controlled Germany, penniless, exhausted, and desperate. Schindler had spent every last mark keeping his workers alive and now turned to Jewish organizations for assistance. He filed a claim with the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, stating he had spent approximately 2.64 million Reichsmarks, nearly $20 million in today's currency, sustaining his workers. The couple left Germany's horrors behind and set out for a fresh start in Argentina, but Schindler's subsequent business ventures collapsed one after another. By 1957, he had returned to Germany alone. He spent the remainder of his life moving between Germany and Israel, supported by the Schindlerjuden, the very people whose lives he had saved. In 1974, decades of heavy drinking finally took their toll, and his liver gave out. He was laid to rest in Israel, where his gravestone reads, "The unforgettable rescuer of 1,200 persecuted Jews." Schindler's story began to surface during his own lifetime, but widespread recognition only arrived after his death. As early as 1949, survivors had begun documenting his deeds in their testimonies, and a journalist had attempted to publish his story, but never succeeded. With the wounds of the war still raw, the world had little appetite for the tale of a good German, especially one with such a checkered past. In 1964, the BBC aired a segment about him while he was still alive and destitute. Yad Vashem considered honoring him among the righteous among the nations, but declined after 2 Jewish men from Krakow accused him of theft and misconduct during the early war years. Everything shifted in 1982, when Australian author Thomas Keneally published his novel Schindler's List, the result of months of thorough research and in-depth interviews with Schindlerjuden, Schindler's wife, and post-war acquaintances. 11 years later, Steven Spielberg's acclaimed film of the same name launched Schindler's story into global consciousness, permanently reshaping the world's understanding of the Holocaust. One survivor later reflected, "Oskar Schindler gave me life, but Steven Spielberg gave me a voice." That same year, Yad Vashem finally added both Oskar and Emily Schindler to the righteous among the nations. So was Oskar Schindler a hero? He was certainly not the conventional, pure-hearted altruist we tend to idealize. His motives were murky, his methods morally questionable, and yet it was precisely his readiness to lie, bribe, and manipulate that made him effective. As Keneally wrote, he secured the salvation of his 1,200 Jews by operating from within the very system, wielding the tools of corruption, bribery, black marketeering, and deception. One of his survivors perhaps said it most plainly, "I don't know what his motives were. I asked him and never got a clear answer, but I don't give a damn. What matters is that he saved our lives." The 1,200 Jews he rescued, and the thousands of descendants who followed, stand as living testament to his transformation. And perhaps that carries an important lesson of its own. Heroes come in all forms, and even the most deeply flawed among us are capable of rising to greatness when history calls for it.